Project Thor, using a satellite with a massive tungsten rod to bomb a city. The theory is that the tungsten would fly through the atmosphere at insane velocities and level city blocks using nothing but kinetic energy alone. Since it uses no propulsion system aside from gravity, and has no technical systems on the rod itself, it would be undetectable and would have next to no defense system for it. The idea was also called rods from God, but shortly after the US military started looking into it, the theory was scrapped due to just the insane cost. You're talking 60-foot, heavy metal rods being shipped to an orbiting weapons system, one by one by one by one. The initial idea was to put missiles in there, until engineers, ballistics specialists, and other scientists deemed it too expensive to even think about, since you'd have the cost of the explosives, the cost of the fuel, and the cost of the materials strong enough to withstand the temperatures and speeds it would be experiencing on re-entry. In total, one of those missiles would have cost the same amount as, obviously adjusting for inflation, the Apollo missions. Just one missile would have cost the same amount of money it took to put men on the moon. That's without operational costs, that's without the cost of technical teams, that's just the missile, nothing else. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware, as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants, to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral, because doctors had removed her legs, and didn't want her to find out. Human samples are often of prime importance, and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country. This guy, from which the quote is taken, was a Nobel Prize winner. Just throwing that out there. The Pentagon documents during the Vietnam War. I'd say they're more disgusting than terrifying, but a document leaked saying the war was unwinnable and the US was still present only to prevent a humiliating defeat. The document leaked in 1969, and combat troops were in Vietnam till 1973, followed by the South Vietnam's collapse in 1975. It's mostly terrifying because over 60,000 Americans were killed and an estimated 1 million Vietnamese, while halfway through the feds realized it was a lost cause but didn't stop. Project 100,000. In the early years of Vietnam, Robert McNamara created Project 100,000 as a way to draft those who previously failed to meet military mental and medical standards. This included a lot of Americans with an IQ below 70. Majority of these men didn't have above a 9th grade education and were, in a sense, a lot like Forrest Gump and Gomer Pyle. Because of obvious learning disabilities and difficulty understanding, these morons were mostly given jobs on the front lines of the war. It was worded as a service project and they were told it would help them gain skills needed to live a better life after the service. In reality, they were cannon fodder for the DoD, and died at a much higher rate than their non-disabled counterparts. These men largely couldn't read, write, or understand why they were in Vietnam or what they were there to do. They suffered more cases of post-traumatic stress, lower unemployment rates, and higher rates of divorce and suicide than non-NSM veterans. Very sad story of the government taking advantage of its own citizens. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. The Stasi routinely pressured people to inform on friends and family members. They find out, probably through another informant, that you've done something wrong. They grab you and tell you that you can avoid jail, or disappearing, if you start reporting on people close to you. Project Pluto. A plan to make a nuclear-powered cruise missile that would fly around low to the ground, spewing radiation and leaving a massive sonic boom, carrying a payload of multiple nuclear bombs to drop on key targets. After dropping those, it would continue to fly around the countryside for weeks. Cancelled in the 60s, but the idea has recently been receiving new attention from both the Russians and Americans, if I recall correctly. When the giant thing thundered overhead at Mach 8, you would be killed by the shock wave, receive a lethal dose of radiation, and be showered with bits of the drive core that would definitely kill you if the other things hadn't. Fun fact, the ceramic manufacturer who built the drive core used the money from the contract to branch off into brewing beer, Adolf Coors. The Davy Crockett atomic rifle. A football-sized nuke hooked to an RPG-style launcher. It couldn't actually propel the nuke far enough that the soldier would be outside the blast, so the plan was for soldiers to dig a foxhole, fire the nuke, then drop into the foxhole and weather the blast that way. Yes, really. Hi there, Private. Launch this nuke and then let the blast wave and huge radiation pulse wash over you while you lay flat in a tiny little ditch. Duck and cover. The intent was that it'd be a great weapon against Soviet tanks trying to travel through Germany, and as a special bonus it'd make the land a radiated hellscape to deny it to the Soviets. Unlike Project Pluto, which was even more terrifying but never got out of the planning stages, the US military actually built and deployed Davy Crockett to soldiers. And that was slightly less insane than the UK's plan for chicken-heated atomic landmines. I wish I was joking. The idea was that they'd bury the mines in the likely Soviet path of attack with a 3 or 4 day timer so that they'd go off and kill the Soviets after they occupied territory in Germany. Is it any wonder that the modern German government is a bit distrustful of the US and UK given all those plans to turn Germany into a radioactive hellscape? The biggest problem UK planners saw was that the timers they wanted to use wouldn't work during the cold German winters. So they fixed the problem by putting a caged chicken and some chicken feed into the mine. The chicken's body heat would keep the timer above the failure temperature so they could nuke those commies and turn Germany into a radioactive hellscape. Just think that's the stuff that came out of the US and UK, which at least in theory had marginally sane governments. Just imagine what has yet to be declassified from the USSR. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment proves the US government will do just about anything to people, even its own citizens. 15 file cabinet drawers were filled with paperwork detailing the FBI spying operation on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Detailing just how far the FBI is willing to go to discredit a single man simply because the director doesn't like his politics. Similar, yet more refined, harassment has been used on others since then, usually resulting in people losing jobs, homes, family, friends and sometimes even requiring they flee the country in order to escape FBI harassment. The Abu Ghraib images are all of men. And roughly half the pictures were never released to the public because they were too inflammatory. Now what could be more inflammatory than what was already released? It's quite simple to figure out. Fully half the Abu Ghraib prison population were women and children, yet not a single image of women or children being tortured were released. Declassified documents detailing the CIA agent Luis Posada Carriles. This shows the hypocrisy of the whole country. As a CIA agent, not only did he engage in terrorism on a grand scale, but he even helped shoot down a civilian airliner, then take refuge within the United States. An almost exact duplicate crime that prompted the US to attack Tripoli and murder Gaddafi's preteen daughter. Then we found out that Carriles, by now a known international terrorist and wanted in multiple countries, was living free in Texas the whole time the Bush administration was conducting their war on terrorism. The Bush administration knew his residence for 6 years before they arrested him on immigration charges at the very end of their administration. This proves that the war on terror was not about eliminating terrorism, it was about cornering the market on terrorism. It was a statement that only the USA is allowed to engage in terrorism. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. The story of how this became known to the public is absolutely fascinating. 4 or 5 people basically walked into an FBI office, and looked important enough that no one cared, and then snuck in at night and just stole all the stuff they could fit in a bag. They kept seeing this weird word COINTELPRO and they were like, COINTELPRO? Then, they sent it to a journalist, where things got wild, and the FBI had a meltdown. They wrote a book about it, But there's a really good video on YouTube with interviews from the people who actually got the documents. The 25-year declassification release of some of the JFK assassination files a few years ago. From the FBI acknowledged 2 shooters. So the FBI knew, the government knew. 2 shooters. There was one assassin. After the first shot was fired, that killed the president with a shot to the head, a Secret Service agent jumped up into the president's vehicle as it sped off. Fumbling for his weapon, the pistol went off accidentally, hitting the president a second time. It would be understandable that the government would want to keep this hidden, as it would be extremely embarrassing to announce that a Secret Service agent wound up shooting the president, even if it was after JFK was already dead. The Khyton Forest Massacre. After the joint invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR, the Russians executed 22,000 Polish officers and buried their remains in mass graves in the Khyton Forest. Years later, some of the bodies were discovered. The Soviets decided to cover up the atrocity by claiming it was the Germans that did it, based on a German pistol found in the area. Many people had their doubts, but this was the Soviet Union. You couldn't just openly question the state. Just before the collapse, the truth was finally revealed. Most shocking, heard it a few weeks ago. Before the Romanian Revolution in 89 inches, the secret police, Securitate, was trained for years to encounter a massive Soviet invasion, like what happened in Czechoslovakia, by using guerrilla tactics, disinformation and terror among the occupying forces. When the revolution broke out, it was thought that the country was infiltrated by the enemy in disguise, but the documents said there were no intervention of Magyar or Russian spies among protesters along all the protests. The army had been brought in, but when Ceausescu asked it to open fire, the army refused. That's when the secret police, dressed in army clothes, started to open fire. Ceausescu had no intention to flood the country with his helicopter. He was preparing for a full-scale invasion, thinking Western or foreign forces are attacking the country. There is also a myth about Ion Iliescu that he would have been actually chosen by foreign forces, USSR and USA, to rule the country after Ceausescu's death, making the revolution into a coup. Also, I realized that the terrorists' panic was actually produced by the secret police, that was implementing its strategy of guerrilla war and terror, being loyal to the communists at the very end. It is shocking because it explains why over 1,000 people died during the revolution, yet most of them happened in strange, short encounters with people dressed in black and using weapons the Romanian military did not had. Securitate also had the latest technologies and equipment and arms. Also realized the secret police had a secret magazine in which they could publish things they were interested in, like the latest methods to break a man with torture or the already mentioned plan in case the country was occupied by a force the army couldn't handle. The Pentagon Papers and the Afghan Papers. The former show that President Johnson deliberately lied to the American people and Congress about the Vietnam War and conducted an illegal, secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, a country we were not at war with. To this day, unexploded ordnance still kills and maims Cambodians. The Afghan Papers show that U.S. policy under Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama and Donald Trump failed to bring peace and modernization to Afghanistan, but also that policymakers were aware that such an outcome was unlikely, all while emphasizing progress in public. Operation Paperclip is still pretty crazy to me. The U.S. brought Nazis into the U.S. after World War II to use them for their science expertise. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy being Wernher von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. These people are partially responsible for one of the darkest times in modern history. It was either we take them, or the Soviets take them, and we weren't just going to line them up and shoot them. The USA knew they were about to start a decades-long rivalry with the USSR, and needed every advantage they could get, including recruiting Germany's best minds when it came to rocketry and other technologies.